The imperial presidency was a term coined by the historian Arthur Schlesinger Jr. in his book. And basically what it does is trace the history of the presidency of the United States and shows how the powers of the presidency have grown throughout the decades. There are three major reasons why this occurred. Number one, wars. During wartime, the president is given extraordinary powers. Lincoln used them during the Civil War by suspending the writ of habeas corpus. Secondly, the nuclear age. It was determined that in case of a nuclear attack, the president would not have time to go to Congress or any other body to okay any kind of retaliatory strike. So the president was given the power to act unilaterally in case of a nuclear attack. And the third reason is national security, that in the case of a terrorist attack or some kind of attack on the United States that's not nuclear, the president could respond immediately. This led to many, many difficult situations in the United States. There's no secret that since World War II, there's never been a declared war. We've been in many wars. Vietnam, Korea, Afghanistan, Iraq. Not one of those wars have been declared by Congress. They were all actions of a president. Also, not after 9/11, we were able to institute various types of surveillance and other types of undemocratic things. So the problem with the imperial presidency is not the power the president has, because there may be good reasons for it, is that we may get a president that abuses the power. Richard Nixon abused the power of the imperial presidency. He spied on people. He used government agencies to punish his political opponents. And what you have now, and what the danger is now, that you may have a president that will use the powers of the presidency to thwart democracy. For example, the president you have, and one of the tactics presidents use to get away from congressional checks, is the executive order. It's simply an order signed by the president to do things without any approval of Congress. The travel ban on Muslims was an executive order signed by President Trump. Congress never did anything about it. The tariffs that have been instituted recently were instituted in the name of national security by President Trump. Congress had no say about it. So the imperial presidency basically is the power of the presidency to provide security for the nation without the consent of the Congress, who are the elected representatives of the people. So that's the danger if you get a president that abuses those powers.
Conversations across time, 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 conversations across time.
Good evening. Welcome to another episode of Conversations Across Time. Tonight, we will be discussing chaos in the White House. I have joining me tonight, to my far right, Rabbi Stephen Wise.
Good evening.
Welcome, Rabbi Wise.
Good evening.
Rabbi Wise was an advisor to President Franklin Roosevelt. Was very much responsible for the Reformed Jewish community in the United States. He immigrated to the United States as a child and was very active during the Second World War. In fact, some people have some questions for you, Rabbi Wise, in terms of the limit or the conservatism that you expressed or exhibited when you were advising President Roosevelt. Seated next to Rabbi Wise is Reich Marshal Hermann Goering, the second most powerful man in Nazi Germany. He founded the Gestapo. After founding the Gestapo, he turned it over to Himmler, and then he was the person who was in charge of the Luftwaffe, which was the German Air Force. He was an ace pilot himself. Thank you.
Frau Hirsch Zion, and I would like to say to the audience that if you want an analogy, I was Hitler's Mike Pence.
Yes. Scary proposition. Scary proposition. Seated next to the Reich Marshal is the 32nd President of the United States, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt. President Roosevelt actually is responsible for the social network that exists today that people are trying to tear apart. A lot of that started with your presidency. And I think you had a lot of problems with people of your own class because they felt that you, as a very wealthy person, you should have been protecting their interests. And instead, you were the president that thought about the people. And so we thank you for that. I don't know, Babette said earlier that her mother loved Franklin Roosevelt. Well, so did my mother. I think parents, all our parents did.
Both parents.
Yes.
Both parents.
I know I was very well loved.
You were very well loved, no question.
Not my grandfather,
I
though.
appreciate that.
Not by the Fuhrer.
We don't care about that, but I appreciate that. Thank you.
And so, seated to my left, she's always here, my co-host, former Pennsylvania State Representative Babette Joseph. Babby, it is so good to see you.
I'm so happy to be here.
And we're thrilled that you're back.
Yeah.
Babby's been away for a little bit, but we're excited that she's back to join us. Now, as I mentioned in my introduction, that the topic tonight is chaos in the White House. As we're taping tonight, you will understand, you will know for certain that there was an op-ed that happened in the New York Times, an anonymous op-ed. We want to get into that. And we also want to talk about Bob Woodward's book, Fear. The reason it becomes important for this panel is because from their perspectives, what do they see? What do they think is going on? And I'm glad that you've traveled across time to be with us. So I want to ask, let's just jump right into the New York op-ed. The New York op-ed was... New York Times. The New York Times, I'm sorry. The New York Times op-ed was attributed to a senior White House official. In it, the person or persons, because I think there's a question as to whether or not it's the opinion of one person. I believe that more than one person contributed to this op-ed. And they talk about the fact that the President Trump, is unfit to be President of the United States, and for a lot of reasons. They are frustrated because Donald Trump gives in to his worst inclinations. I'd like to ask Rabbi Wise, if you were advising Donald Trump, what kind of advice would you give?
I would tell him the truth. I would tell him the truth about his immigration policy, that his immigration policy is totally evil and totally wicked.
Hurts the country.
But we're going to talk about immigration, and we're going to talk about immigration a little later on. But I'm saying specifically, if you were advising someone as a Donald Trump, who certainly exhibits childlike behavior.
Please, children don't act that way.
What would your advice be, or would you, in fact, sound an alarm bell? Would you sound an alarm bell?
I would tell Mr. Trump the truth. I would tell the truth about how the economy isn't working for working people. I would tell him about how his immigration policies are destroying families. I would tell him that his actions in handling the hurricane damage in Puerto Rico was a total disaster. I would tell the truth. That is what a responsible advisor, counselor to any ruler, king, president, whatever, would do. And instead of, unfortunately, we have a president that doesn't want to hear the truth.
Well, you looking from your historical approach and seeing him, he doesn't want to hear the truth. I'm sorry.
Well, what I was going to say was, he can see the truth every day if he just turns on the television and listens to responsible and respectable people in this country.
He doesn't.
He does, because he takes options against everything that's been said that you try to tell him that is the truth, and he'll say it's not the truth. That's the way he deals with everything. He looks at it in his own lens. He doesn't care what you're telling him. He doesn't take the advice of somebody who's reasonable and responsible. He believes he's reasonable and responsible, and after all, he's had these views for 30 years. So you're not going to change his view on economics, even though it's disgraceful and ridiculous, and 98% of the economists in the country say it's not going to work, or his views on national security, which every national security advisor has told him that his views are ridiculous, and getting away from NATO and the various contracts and treaties that we have around the world, and going through this isolationist policy that's never going to work in a globalized economy.
Roosevelt, I don't want to interrupt you.
No, you can interrupt.
And
Go ahead.
due respect, Rabbi, there's no one on this panel that can speak with greater expertise than myself, since the Fuhrer had many things in terms of behavioral problems that your President Trump has.
No argument here.
He was impulsive, he was egomaniacal, and how we dealt with him is we tried the same way some of your advisors do to work around him, and sometimes it worked, but when there were outstanding crisis and he wouldn't listen to anyone, we got in tremendous trouble. And in fact, he would go crazy, and just like your President Trump, and yell at people and scream at people and want his own way. And the policies many times didn't work, and if he had followed our advice, we probably would have won the war. And the best example I could give you is Stalingrad, when he refused to allow our great Wehrmacht to withdraw. So I know what you're dealing with, and I don't think you can work around egomaniacal, unstable leaders and expect to have a good outcome. The Fuhrer was the same way. Now, we were better organized. The Fuhrer, in my opinion, was way smarter than Herr Trump.
That was my question.
However, you cannot work around people with that kind of personality who won't listen, and when push comes to shove, insist on their own way. And your country is going down a treacherous road if you think you can control this man.
Yes,
well, I
and
don't think anybody thinks that they can control him. Nobody's trying to control him. But
I think we're trying to
when you read Woodward's book, in conjunction with the op-ed, in conjunction with the other books that have been written by Omarosa and Wolf, you find this chaotic nature of the administration. And there are certain people that are doing whatever they can to make sure that he doesn't make a tremendously bad mistake, like when Cohn pulled the letter where he was going to do away with the treaty with South Korea on trade, which would have had unbelievably major implications for national security.
Herr Roosevelt,
so
that only
you're
works
not going to change him,
that only works some of the time. And
I understand
when there's a major crisis and the leader is going to insist on doing his own way, you're never going to be able to sway him. I had the same experience with the Fuhrer, and I'll give you another example, and you could. The tariffs. Everyone around your president tried to talk him out of implementing the tariffs, and he didn't listen, and he implemented them. So on the one side, they stop him sometimes. Now, what happens if it's he's insulted by another world leader, and he goes off on a tangent and he starts a war? They're not going to be able to stop that. And we had the same problem, and we had really smart people around the Fuhrer, and he still insisted on doing things his own way. He thought he knew more, just like your president did. He thought he knew more than the general staff, and that's why we got whipped in Russia.
Well, here's the difference, though. Here's the difference. In Germany, I don't know what the percentage was, the number of people that were behind the Fuhrer.
33%.
I was way
That's
more
what
than that.
that's what we got in the election in 1933. 33% of the Reichstag was us.
And at this
33%, which I think is pretty close to the same amount of loyal supporters Herr Trump has.
Yes, how many newspapers and how many radio broadcasts were there in Germany that were protesting the things that he was doing at the time?
I must
Really?
point
He
out-
spoke
I
to
must
millions
also
of
point
people.
out
He had
there
a
is-
crowd
we
of
do-
a million people.
Unfortunately,
We had
we
this-
do have this
the
independent
Fuhrer-
news media that these persons in the White House are contacting to sound the alarm about Mr. Trump's erratic behavior. However, I can't count on the old story about the people going through the evil counselors to get to the czar. I mean, Mr. Trump is part of a larger, is a symptom of a larger disease in our political system.
That's what
How money,
Times letter says.
yes, how money and foreign influence can take over the can put bad people in government.
But let me ask this question, because
You,
we are when we think about Hitler, and hear what the Reich Marshal said. If Hitler had listened to his advisors, Germany would have prevailed.
But what kind of advisors
But
did he
wait
have?
a minute.
the
No
Fuhrer
matter
had
what-
great advisors. I was one of his advisors, and I'm great.
We're not. That's
Did-
speculation anyway. You don't know that.
He would
I
have
mean,
done
he did
better.
whatever
I
he
think
could
we
do,
could
Hitler,
say-
to do what he did, and he lost. A lot of it had to do with me, because when we
Yes.
entered the war, we changed everything that had to do with his invasions in Russia, and we opened up other fronts, and we eventually defeated their army. And it was because of me, not
President
because of you.
You were very, very reluctant to have a second front.
Well,
And
sure.
only after the Russians were able to defeat us in Stalingrad did you and Churchill agree to the second front. But the most of the burden was put on the Russians. And if we had been able to defeat Russia on the Eastern Front, it would have been a terrible battle for you to be able to invade Normandy and Europe and win.
Yeah, but you have to understand the circumstances. We were fighting a world war on two diverse fronts.
Doesn't
we're
matter.
fighting the Japanese
I'm
in
not-
the Pacific,
I'm not
and we had to
saying that.
allocate.
I'm
We
not-
had to allocate resources in Europe. We did everything we could, and by the
Hey,
way,
Roosevelt,
it worked.
I'm not arguing you
We
had
won,
to fight a war
yes.
on two fronts, but that's exactly what happened to us. And if we had won on the Eastern Front, we could have won on the Western
You
front.
could have,
Not
but that's
necessarily. You
That's
could
not.
have- you have
that's not
extended
the
yourselves
point-
only
the
so
point-
far.
Wait a
The
minute,
point I'm
gentlemen.
trying to make is, and I think, Mr. Roosevelt, you're looking at it from hindsight, you would not tolerate the kind of chaos, and you would not tolerate the kind of advisors.
And that's-
That's right.
What the people in the United States are counting on, and what Crawford has said about the op-ed, is that these people are controlling him. And what I am saying, having dealt with it, is don't have any false hopes. There's going to be a time when there's a crisis that you won't be able to control that person, just like
Right.
we weren't able to control
There's
the
no
Fuhrer.
false hope here. There's no hope that they're going to be able to control him completely, and I know that.
I agree with
But
Mr.
what
Roosevelt.
they did, what this does, what the op-ed does, what Woodward's book does, is to signal the chaos, to signal the dysfunction, to signal the fact that he's totally incompetent, and spread that word around so that the people can take control, the people can make the change, and the people can do that by voting.
Yes.
An election
The
is coming up
midterms are
in
coming
less
up.
than 2 months where they can turn the tide.
Let
They
me
can
ask
vote
this-
this Congress over to the Democrats to change the whole course of history here. And that's what they have to do.
But
I
let me
agree,
ask this
Mr.
question.
I agree,
The-
excuse
the
me, but-
op-ed- The
That's what
op-ed,
we
the
have
op-ed,
to
the
do.
op-ed points out the problems with Trump. Bob Woodward's book, he's tremendously respected because of his. He's actually written about 9 presidents, and of course we know what happened with he and Bernstein and exposing Nixon. But my question is, we've had signs. There have been signs about this man being incompetent and unfit for the office of the presidency for a long time. I just don't know. I don't see how the op-ed, while it signals something to some people, how many of those diehard Trump followers even read the New York Times?
I
don't. And
have
that
to
they'll
say,
still
quite
follow.
honestly, I'm shocked at the American electorate and the American people. There are things that were made public about Trump that
He should never have been
If they were
elected.
made public about the Fuhrer would have fallen from power early on in 33 and 34. When
There was
the
even a-
scandal, when the scandal was going to come out about the Fuhrer and his niece having an affair, we got rid of the niece. But if the scandal had come out, it would have ruined Hitler's career. Now you people tolerated your candidate for the highest office abusing women, grabbing their private parts. So what kind of electorate
Only a
do you
small
have?
part of the electorate. Only a small part of the electorate
He
agreed
is a
with that.
minority
The point
president.
is that if the
So
people
was
who
the
should have
Fuhrer.
voted would have voted, this would never have happened.
So was the
and that's
Fuhrer.
the lesson that was learned. And the people,
We'll see if
not
it's learned.
not op-ed writers, not
We'll see if
Woodward,
it's learned.
they can sound the alarm, but it's the people that have to make the change. And they have the opportunity to do it. And now's the time to start.
President
Start
Roosevelt-
now with this election in 2018 and turn the tide.
I
And
agree,
that's
before
what'll
it's
win.
too late.
I agree with you with that
I
point,
agree wholeheartedly.
President. But if that doesn't happen, if the electorate
Then
doesn't
we're in
turn
If that doesn't
way,
happen, I agree we're in a lot of trouble.
okay.
Yes,
so
that is-
we're agreement on that, President Roosevelt.
Yes,
But
that
there
is
are
true.
signs that it is happening. There are
Oh, there
signs
are
that people
many
are
signs.
getting ready to vote. There are signs that younger people are running for office and they are attracting the cohorts, the people who usually don't vote, the young people
And
are
it's
now
a diverse challengers.
Yes.
There are a
Yes.
lot of women, a lot of blacks, Hispanics,
non-white people, right,
and young people. And if you
Yes.
notice, the first speech that Obama gave in support of all of this was at the University of Illinois.
Of course.
And I think he's going to go from university to university.
I wouldn't be
Because the young
surprised.
people who never vote in this midterm election have to get out and vote. And people, all the minorities have to get out and vote. And this guy is a latent racist. I don't care what
He's
you want
not
to say.
latent.
I think he's over.
He's
He-
blatant.
not
He's
So
very
it's
really
overt.
blatantly
racist.
wicked.
Blatant or overt. It's hard to say that he's overt. I mean, having an Orthodox Jewish
Excuse me, President.
daughter and
Excuse me,
grandchildren.
President
But
Roosevelt.
he has
I have-
very-
excuse me, because so when you start to get the racists, of course, the Germans have to take all the heat.
Oh, yeah,
But
we do.
but I have to say to you, quite
You have
honestly,
expertise.
I quite honestly have to
Americans
say to
do
you
too.
that. And I don't disagree that your current president is a racist, an out-and-out racist. However, you had many presidents who were racist.
Yes.
Woodrow Wilson,
Yes.
Yes, he
Harry
was.
Truman
Yes.
used the N-word all the time, and his wife wouldn't let any black people in near the house. So so racism is a system.
And neither would my great grandmother, but
Right,
that's not today.
But racism
may I
is a
point out that
systematic
it was
problem.
it was under Harry Truman that racial desegregation was
Of the
ended in the
military.
military, and Mr. Truman was the first president to speak to a convention of the National Association for the Advancement of
I
Colored
mean,
People.
things have changed.
but-
you have to admit that.
but-
Since Hitler. Even
But-
since
but-
me.
So
but-
at least they may have
I-
been blatant racists, but these men may have been blatant racists, but at least Truman knew that out-and-out racism was right after the war just wrong, was not acceptable.
People have to be careful when they're running for office not to alienate voters. And
Excuse-
if people will vote regardless of
For
race,
Joseph, the point is he got elected because he appealed to the racial divisions in
you
the
can't
country,
remember-
just like the Fuhrer got elected originally
he was
because of
still
that.
a minority president. He did not win the popular vote. We did not really want to put him there.
You know, I am
Excuse me,
reminded.
they said the same thing about the Fuhrer. He only got 33%, but he was there and he instituted policies.
I'm not saying that we leave him alone and we don't criticize him, we don't fight him, we don't resist him, but we should, when we do that, we should take comfort from the fact that he is a minority president.
And aren't we forgetting
You
one
shouldn't
very,
take
very
comfort
important
about
thing?
anything
He's-
except getting rid of
Wait
him.
a second.
I
He's
agree.
presently under investigation by the FBI and the Justice Department. And
Everybody.
by the way, the guilty pleas are falling in place. People are turning every day against him. And more and more people are testifying against him. And sooner or later, and hopefully sooner, all of this is going to come to a head.
But I must
and
point
the more
out
that it
that
does, then and along with all these signs from Woodward and op-eds and everything else are all going to come together and make it impossible for him to win another term, and that's really what the most important.
Right.
But
and
I
in the
must point
interim,
out, I must
and
point
in
out,
the interim,
Candidate.
if you take control of the Congress, you can make life even more miserable
Yes,
for him
but we need
by,
a candidate.
by
I
heading
must
up
point
all
out,
the committees.
excuse me, but I must point out,
investigations.
I agree that I believe the Democratic Party does have a good chance of taking the Senate and the House, but there will be what you call nowadays pushback from Mr. Trump's supporters, and we have to be prepared for that. And I'm not saying ask their permission or try to appease them. Implement the policies, fight against Mr. Trump's policies, and try to implement our own policies, and be prepared for the fact that Mr. Trump's supporters will probably stage some sort of violence. Because that's like the dictators that Mr. Trump admires, like Putin in Russia, Kim Jong-un in North Korea, and the other authoritarian dictators, Orban in Hungary. Those are the people he respects. Dictators, authoritarians.
Men he respects.
But I want to ask you this.
Your president had the Führer's book of speeches by his night table. It was the only book he read. And
Yes.
his first wife attested to that. So
I'm
the one he
surprised they
admired
couldn't
most
even
was
read
the
that.
Führer.
I agree. So
But
I have
wait a
no
minute,
doubt that he
he
might
is-
organize his own unit of stormtroopers
But that's
like your
exactly,
Führer did.
That's exactly
hasn't
my
happened,
point.
and it
that's
won't
exactly
happen.
my point. I do not feel comfortable when I watch this man at these rallies, and he says
scary.
he says things like, if I don't win, if we don't have a Republican Congress, then it's you failed. And he's inciting people towards violence. He keeps talking about the radical left and violence. He is actually a danger to this country.
Yes, he is.
That is true.
So with that being said,
Nobody
Let's be
disputes that.
prepared. Let us be prepared
Yes.
to be conscious and stand up to this evil
but we
man.
must.
When I see the rallies that you allow him to have and you put on your cable news network, it reminds me of the Nuremberg rallies we had.
Yes.
And the way we staged those events, it reminds me very much of that. And the way that people yelled and screamed at the Führer and loved him, it was a cult of personality. And I see the same thing occurring in your country now.
Very similar.
We are drawing to the end of this episode, but one of the things I want to end with is that it seems to me that the Trump rallies are very similar to the Nuremberg rallies.
I'm afraid so.
And they are staged.
Yes.
And they have a handful of minority people, and I think it's a troop that travels around the country. And every time that he speaks, two of them are put up there behind him.
The guy with the plaid shirt.
I mean,
he wears a striped shirt sometimes.
But I mean, I think that there's a troop of minority persons that travel around and they stand behind Trump with T-shirts on saying "Blacks for Trump."
They're paid flunkies, yeah.
They're
paid a lot.
Paid actors,
Just
yes.
They are paid actors because this man is staging these rallies. So I think
Come on,
with that
Trump
being
never
in mind,
pays anybody. He just probably promised
someone's paying them. But what we have to keep in mind is that the important thing, and we're going to be talking about this when we'll talk about immigration, but we're also going to be talking about the need for everyone that is watching this show. I challenge you to call 10 people to make certain they vote. That's the only thing that's going to help us. You've got to vote. And with that, I want to thank my guests for being here. This has been another Conversations Across Time. We'll see you next week. We'll be talking about immigration. Thank you very much. Thank you, Rabbi Wise.
Thank you.
Thank you, Reichsmarschall.
Thank you.
Thank you, President Roosevelt.
My pleasure.
Of course, Babby, thank you.
Gracias.
We will see you next week. Good night.
Conversations across time, 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 conversations.